May 12, 1945. Lancaster, England. The trucks rolled to a stop outside a brick building that once held wool, but now held something far heavier: fear. 37 German women climbed down onto wet gravel, their boots worn thin, their gray uniforms stiff with days of travel. They'd been radio operators, captured when everything collapsed near Hamburg. They'd heard stories about the British, terrible stories, that prisoners starved, that women suffered worst of all, that mercy was just another word they'd forgotten. The gate swung open, and a young British soldier stepped forward. He held his cap in his hands, and in broken German he said something they never expected to hear. "Please, this way." They froze, not because of the word itself, but because of how softly he said it. No shouting, no pushing, no violence. One woman, tall and blonde, barely 23 years old, stared at him like he'd spoken a language from another planet. Because in a way he had. The war had been years of orders barked like weapons, of every interaction dripping with threat. And here, on enemy soil, in the land they'd been taught to hate, the first word was gentle. It made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. Inside the barracks, whispers spread like wildfire. "They're coming!" The door opened, but fury didn't walk through. Instead, a British officer with a clipboard appeared, along with a nurse carrying a medical bag. And behind them, a cart stacked with tea kettles and white cups. Nobody moved. The officer cleared his throat. "We need your names for records. After that, tea and a quick health check. You'll have beds assigned by 4 o'clock. Still silence hung in the air like smoke. Then the nurse, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes, poured the first cup. Steam curled upward in the cold. She held it out. The tall blonde took it with shaking hands, lifted it to her lips, tasted warmth and sugar, and her face changed. Not into tears, not yet, but into something harder to name. Confusion, relief, shame, gratitude all at once. The war had taught them to expect pain. The peace offered them tea. If this moment already shifted how you see war, stay with me. What comes next will surprise you even more. 6 weeks earlier, these women weren't prisoners. They'd been stationed at a communications post outside Lübeck, routing messages for a German unit falling back west. The work was technical, boring, essential. Most had volunteered. Some believed deeply in the cause. Some just needed work. All of them were young. They wore uniforms. They saluted. They believed in different ways in what they were doing. Then the British Second Army arrived. No dramatic shootout. No heroic last stand. Their commanding officer told them to burn the code books and surrender. They lined up in a courtyard at dawn, hands raised, silent. A British lieutenant walked the line checking for weapons. He found none. In English they barely understood. He told them they were now prisoners of war, protected under the Geneva Convention. One of them, Erica, a clerk from Dresden, would later write, "I thought protection meant a cell. I didn't know it could mean courtesy." That single sentence captured everything that would follow. The gap between what they expected and what they received would define their entire experience. War had taught them one vocabulary. Peace was about to teach them another. The journey to England felt strange, like moving through a dream where the rules kept changing. First, a camp near Bremen. Tents, barbed wire, food delivered in crates stamped with Allied labels. The rations were basic but regular. Nobody hit them. Nobody screamed. It was unsettling in its ordinariness. Then west to the coast, loaded onto a ship with Polish refugees who'd lost everything, French workers trying to get home, and Italian soldiers singing in the cargo hold like they were on holiday. The crossing was rough. Most got seasick. A British sailor brought them crackers and ginger tea. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just left the tray and walked away. It was the smallest gesture, but it stayed with them. In the chaos of war, small kindnesses become enormous. They become proof that humanity hasn't entirely vanished. When they docked in Southampton, the air smelled different. Salt and coal and something green they couldn't quite name. Grass. England in springtime. They were marched through processing, photographed, cleaned, given fresh underwear and wool blankets. Everything was formal. Everything was respectful. Nobody called them Nazis. Nobody spat. It was eerie, this absence of hatred. They'd been prepared for violence. This procedural coldness was somehow more confusing. The camp in Lancashire had been a textile warehouse before the war. High ceilings, iron beams, long windows that let in pale northern light. The British had converted it quickly but thoughtfully. Sleeping quarters with partitions for privacy. A dining hall with long tables. Bathrooms with running water and soap. A small medical station with actual supplies. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean. It was organized. It was humane. On the second morning, a sergeant gathered them in the yard. "You will work," he said through a translator. "Light duties, kitchen help, laundry, groundskeeping. You'll be paid a small wage, as the law requires. You can receive letters. You can write home once a week, though we'll check what you send. You will not be mistreated." He paused, looking at their faces, reading the disbelief written there. "You are soldiers. You will be treated as soldiers." That phrase hung in the cold morning air. Soldiers, not criminals, not animals, soldiers. That night in the barracks, someone cried, not from despair, but from exhaustion, from the slow, confusing realization that everything they'd been taught about enemies, about cruelty, about what defeat looked like, wasn't holding true anymore. The propaganda had promised hellfire. Reality delivered routine. Everything changed 3 days later. A guard named Private Collins, farm country accent, working man's hands, was handing out blankets. One of the women, Greta, a typist from Munich, hesitated before taking hers. She looked at him, then down at the blanket, then back up. "Thank you," she whispered in German. He nodded. Then, almost embarrassed, he pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket, Cadbury's in purple wrapper, and placed it on top of the blanket. "For you," he said in broken German. She stared at it. Her hands trembled. She took it, held it against her chest, and her eyes filled with tears. He turned and walked away quickly, like he was ashamed of his own kindness. Later, Greta would write in a letter, "I cried over chocolate, not because I was starving, though I was, but because he didn't have to give it to me. That's what broke me." It was the breaking that mattered. Not breaking down, but breaking open. Breaking through the shell of ideology and propaganda to find something real underneath. That chocolate bar, that tiny gesture, did more to undermine everything she'd been taught than any speech or punishment could have done. Behind this moment was policy. In 1940, the British War Office had issued a directive, 6 words that shaped everything. Prisoners are soldiers, not slaves. The logic was threefold. First, security. Well-treated prisoners were less likely to riot or try to escape. A content camp was a safe camp. Second, diplomacy. Britain's own soldiers were held in German camps, and what you do comes back to you. Cruelty invites cruelty. Restraint might buy protection for your own men. Third, morality. The British saw themselves as protectors of civilization. And civilization, they believed, wasn't measured by winning. It was measured by how you behaved when you had all the power and your enemy had none. This wasn't just sentiment. It was strategy wrapped in principle, pragmatism dressed as ethics. But to the women in Lancashire, it felt like mercy. They didn't know about directives or diplomatic calculations. They only knew that they'd expected to be broken, and instead were being treated like human beings. Daily life found a rhythm. Wake up at 6:30. Breakfast at 7, porridge, tea, bread with butter, sometimes jam. Once a week, an egg. The food was plain but enough. Nobody went hungry. Nobody had to fight for scraps or trade belongings for extra rations. Work started at 8. Shifts rotated. Kitchen duty, laundry, mending clothes, tending the small vegetable garden behind the building. The work was easy. The supervision was light. A soldier checked in twice daily. He never raised his voice. He never threatened. He just made sure everyone was where they should be, then moved on. Lunch at noon. Dinner at 6. In between, letters were handed out. Mail call was sacred. Women lined up in silence, hoping. When a name was called, faces brightened. When it wasn't, faces fell. One woman, Annalisa, a driver from Hamburg, received nothing for 5 weeks. Then in mid-June, 3 letters arrived at once. She sat on her bed and read them slowly. crying quietly, while everyone else gave her space. They understood. The letters were lifelines to a world that felt increasingly distant, increasingly unreal. In the evenings, they sang German folk songs, mostly Lily Marlene. The guards didn't stop them. Once, a British officer stood outside the door, listening. When the song ended, he walked away without saying anything. Order wore down fear. Consistency wore down propaganda. There were moments, small and precise, that stuck in memory. Erica, the clerk, was assigned to work in the camp office. One afternoon, she noticed a photograph pinned behind the duty sergeant's desk. A young woman in a floral dress, holding a baby. Erica stared at it. The sergeant saw her looking. "My wife," he said quietly. "And my son. Haven't seen them in 2 years." She nodded. She didn't know what to say. He turned back to his papers. "War's hard on everyone," he said. She thought about that for days. The idea that the enemy also had families, also had losses, also carried grief. It was obvious, of course, but war makes you forget the obvious. War makes you forget that the man on the other side is also just a man. Greta, the typist, was working in the laundry when British uniforms came through. She found a letter in a pocket, unfinished, crumpled, ink-smudged. It began, "Dearest Mum, I hope this finds you well. The weather here is awful, but spirits are good." She folded it carefully and gave it to the soldier on duty. "I found this," she said in broken English. He thanked her. The next day, he brought her a packet of cookies. She wrote later, "I'd been taught they were monsters. I'd been wrong." Annalisa, the driver, was older, 31, a widow. Her husband had died at Stalingrad. She rarely spoke. But one evening during a thunderstorm, the power went out. The barracks went dark. Women huddled together, whispering nervously. A guard appeared with a lantern. He set it on a table in the center of the room, said nothing, and left. The light flickered. Shadows danced on the walls. Slowly, the fear passed. Annalisa looked at the lantern and thought, "This is what kindness looks like. A small flame in the dark." She'd spent years in darkness. This small light meant everything. By July, something had shifted. The women no longer flinched when a guard approached. They made eye contact. They joked carefully with the kitchen staff. They began asking questions. "Why do you treat us this way?" The answers varied. Some guards shrugged. Some said, "Orders." One, a Welsh soldier named Davies, said simply, "Because it's right." That phrase, "because it's right," was repeated in the barracks that night. Debated. Tested against everything they'd been told. Ideology, it turned out, couldn't survive constant decency. You can't maintain hatred in the face of daily kindness. You can't believe people are monsters when they keep proving they're not. The transformation was slow, almost invisible day to day, but profound over weeks and months. They were being deprogrammed not through lectures or punishment, but through the simple, steady experience of being treated well. In late August, the camp commander, a colonel named Hargreaves, white-haired and steady, announced they would observe a day of remembrance for the end of the war in Europe. It wasn't a celebration. It was a pause. At 11 o'clock, the entire camp gathered in the yard. British soldiers on one side, German prisoners on the other. A chaplain, soft-voiced, read from Ecclesiastes. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. Then silence. 2 minutes. The only sound was wind moving through the rafters. When it ended, Hargreaves stepped forward. He didn't speak to the prisoners. He spoke to his own men, but the women heard every word. "We have won," he said, "but we have not lost our souls." It wasn't a grand speech. It was a reminder. A line held. That night, someone in the barracks whispered, "They are not like us." Someone else replied, "No, they are what we were told we were." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They'd been told they represented civilization, order, the future. Now they were prisoners of the people who actually embodied those things. By autumn, letters from home began to change. Germany was in ruins. Families were scattered. Food was scarce. Some women learned their cities no longer existed. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, ashes. One letter, read aloud, said, "You are safer where you are." That sentence hung in the air. When lists for going home were posted in November, some women volunteered immediately. They wanted to return to whatever was left, but others hesitated. A few refused. Greta, the typist, wrote to her mother, "I know you want me back, but here I am fed. I am safe. I am treated like a person. I don't know what's waiting for me there." She stayed. By 1947, records show over 25,000 German prisoners, men and women, remained in Britain by choice, working on farms, in factories, in rebuilding efforts. Some married British citizens, some never left. It wasn't loyalty. It was survival and something else, something harder to measure. Maybe it was the simple recognition that they'd found something here they couldn't find at home. Stability, dignity, the absence of chaos. In the camp archives, a note survives. Handwritten, unsigned, dated March 1946. They expected punishment. They found process. They feared revenge. They received fairness. That is how you defeat an ideology. Not with a bullet, with a blanket. Erika, the clerk from Dresden, returned to Germany in spring 1948. She carried a small bundle, letters, a photograph of the camp, and a bar of Cadbury's chocolate she never opened. Years later, in an interview, she was asked what she remembered most. She paused. "The sound of the kettle," she said. "Every morning, boiling water for tea. It was the sound of order, of normal life, of a world that hadn't ended." She smiled faintly. "I'd forgotten what that sounded like." Greta stayed in England. She married a school teacher from York. She learned to bake scones. She never returned to Munich. In 1953, she received a letter from Annalisa, who'd gone back to Hamburg and was working as a translator. The letter ended with a line that Greta copied into her diary. "We were told they would destroy us. Instead, they gave us back our dignity. I don't know how to repay that." Greta kept that letter until she died. Annalisa, the widow, the driver, the quiet one, did return. She found her city rebuilt, unrecognizable, alive again in ways she hadn't expected. She worked. She remarried. She had a daughter. In 1961, she took her daughter to a museum in Hamburg where an exhibition on prisoner camps was being held. There was a photograph, grainy, black and white, of women in a British camp. She recognized herself in the second row. Her daughter asked, "What was it like?" Annalisa looked at the photograph for a long time. "It was the first place," she said quietly, "where I was not afraid." The camp in Lancashire was closed in 1949. The building returned to private hands, converted back to storage, then offices, then apartments. The yard where the women stood in silence that August morning is now a parking lot. But the memory endures, not in monuments, not in speeches, but in letters, diaries, in the quiet testimony of women who expected cruelty and received restraint, who believed they would be erased and were instead counted, fed, paid, addressed by name. It wasn't mercy, it was policy. But policy executed with humanity becomes impossible to separate from grace. The tall blonde, the one who took the first cup of tea, never wrote her name in the records. She appears only as prisoner 14, Signals Auxiliary, Hamburg. But her presence echoes in a letter fragment found in the camp archive. Undated, unsigned, written in careful English. "I thought we would be forgotten. I thought we would be nothing. But they gave us tea. They gave us blankets. They gave us back the idea that we were still human. I didn't know until then how much I needed to be reminded." If these stories have moved you, if they've made you rethink what war does to people and what peace can restore, there are more voices waiting to be heard. More moments that history nearly forgot. They braced for shouting. They heard pleas. They expected darkness. They were given light. Not blinding, not bright. Just enough to see by. Just enough to remember they were not monsters. That they had never been. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them something rarer. That restraint is a kind of courage. That dignity once lost can be returned. That even in defeat there is a way forward. And it begins with a knock, a door opened, a cup of tea offered, a single word spoken softly. Please.